Well, thank you. It's great to be here, and it's wonderful to be with my esteemed colleagues, Seth and Lon. And we're really excited to be talking about how we power the energy transition, especially innovation and execution on the ground. And so with that, I will go ahead and get started. First question is to Lon. I might start with talking about the increasing electricity demands. We all know that due to AI deployment, which I believe was just discussed in the previous panel, as well as electrification demands, as well as industry demands, that electricity demand is increasing. And so from a utility perspective, I would love to hear about how you're balancing the need for more power with more reliable power as well as clean power, and how, as you balance that, it impacts the ratepayers.
Oh, that could be the full panel right there. Yes. So I'll try to be brief, but I mean, it really is about that balance. And the main things, and we heard this already today, it's capacity, and I would also say it's affordability. When you have these new large loads coming in, you're building out infrastructure to support that. Well, that revenue isn't coming in until they're energized, right? And there's a long ramp sometimes. And so there's a mismatch there where, typically, you're thinking, this new load spins the meter, it brings revenue, that reduces everybody's rates, right? Well, that actually doesn't occur until you have you have that load there. And so you've got the transmission upgrades, you might have increasingly generation capacity investments that have to be made to facilitate this. And so you've got to think, well, how can I help with that affordability? How can I also make sure that that load is going to be there? So if I build out $100 million of transmission and another, a few $100 million on, say, some types of capacity resource, and that load doesn't materialize, then we're in really bad shape, right? And so it takes modernization of tariffs and contracts to make sure that you've got protections for all customers there, but they're still reasonable, they still encourage economic development. So again, a balance that you actually see in the contracting. And then you need to move into the pricing. How do you actually price this product if you have marginal costs that are higher than your embedded costs in your tariffs? That's an interesting dynamic to think about and how that leads to downward or upward pressure on rates. And then it's about partnership. How can you form creative partnerships to help with that affordability? How can you have creative structures that bring forward clean energy to serve that type of load? And so that's why we're really proud to have an announcement earlier this year with Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Nucor, where we had an MOU and we said, hey, we're going to work on a variety of different ways to bring forward clean energy capacity in an affordable manner for everybody. And already we've had a lot of success. We've had tariffs approved. We started with demand response tariffs, so that's lowest hanging fruit. That's the best bang for the buck. And so we updated our valuation method. We got some new tariffs available for tapping into backup generators that are on these data centers, right? And just general more flexibility in our programs. And that filters all the way down to residential. So this is not just for them. It's for everyone in different programs. And so we started with that. We're moving, we already have approval for our clean energy programs, so over 6 gigawatts of new clean energy programs that can be linked up to these large loads. At the same time, we are looking at a bunch of different VPP style programs and launched a really big solar plus storage program in North Carolina. So it's going to take all the above, but that balance is just so key, and you don't get that balance without collaboration, without the right regulatory framework, and without all parties sort of leaning in. And I can talk more about that, but that would be my first stab at that big question.
Great, yeah, it is a very big question. I think all the above is something we're going to hear frequently over the next 2 days. It's really exciting about the new partnerships that you've announced, but I'm really excited to have one of your other partners here, which is EnergyHub. So Seth, your company, EnergyHub, provides software to enable dynamic load shaping for utilities to help them manage load growth. And I understand you're working with over 70 different companies in 30 states. Can you enlighten us all a little bit on what load shaping is and what are some of the trends that you're seeing in terms of electricity demand and the efficacy of demand response programs?
Yeah, I feel like I should just yield my time back to Lon for that last part.
I'll fill in.
And thank you for the opportunity to speak here and talk about sort of some of what we're doing at scale. Lon mentions VPP programs, so we power Duke Energy's smart thermostat and solar plus storage VPP programs. Across the country, across North America, I just heard this morning that we crossed 1.5 million DERs that are actively participating in our utility programs, which is really exciting. And I guess in general, just the concept of load flexibility is it gives you the ability to match demand to the available supply, right? And so Lon mentioned lowest hanging fruit. It used to be that you'd have a really hot day or a really cold morning in the winter, and you'd say, all right, we don't have enough power to supply or to transmit the power that's necessary. So rather than going out and automatically just building new supply, let's have the ability to throttle demand just a little bit to stay within those bounds. And that I think, that was a beachhead for load flexibility that gave a clear value stream and said, okay, if you can do this load flexibility for less than what it costs to build a traditional poles and wires or power plants type investment, go ahead and do that. And now that we're in sort of yes and mode, all of the above mode, it's a tool in the toolbox that allows you to manage peak demand, but also to shape load. So to make sure that as you take on lots of new EV charging, that isn't all hitting the grid all at once and blowing up pieces of the distribution network, allowing you to say, all right, I've got excess solar, excess wind, let's move the demand to when that's available. And so load flexibility just essentially opens up that possibility.
Great, and you had mentioned some of the weather events. I'd love to stay on this question about the trends and hear from you, Lon, a little bit more about what you're seeing in the Southeast region, specifically, in light of the extreme weather we've seen over the last recent weeks and months. And then also to ask you, how are ratepayers impacted, not just by the changing environment, but by the clean energy transition as well?
Yeah, well, I think everybody saw the hurricane season this year, and it went straight for our service territories each time, and the devastation. It was just, really words couldn't describe it, and the communities have a long road to recovery, but I think again it's reinforcement of this new normal. This new normal is extreme weather events. And it's not like it's going to get any better or more mild. And so you have to think about, well, how can you prepare for that future? So at Duke Energy, we do a comprehensive climate risk assessment for all of our states, and we look at a variety of different factors and risk factors, high winds, extreme cold, extreme heat, right? Things of that nature, wildfires. And then we come up with plans and to try to harden the system with that. But honestly, this is not a low-cost future when you're having to deal with these extreme weather events. It just isn't. We had to replace, I think it was around 18,000 poles and 16,000 transformers in Hurricane Helene, right? So that is just the scale. We had to rebuild the wires, and it would stretch from North Carolina all the way to California. That's how many miles of wire we had to replace, and we did it basically within 3 weeks. Right, so amazing effort, but rebuilding a huge chunk of your distribution system in part of a state is not cheap. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have regulatory mechanisms. So we have it in North Carolina where we securitize it, so that helps with affordability. But we've got to be smart. We have to be proactive. Sometimes being proactive requires upfront capital to then save capital down the road, and that's something that policymakers, stakeholders, utilities will all have to get behind, because that does put upward pressure on rates in the near term, but there's long-term savings, right? So that is the first part of the question. The second part, I think, was on the clean energy transition just in general, right? And so that's another proposition where you have higher capital costs on the front end, but lower fuel spend and hedging value in the long term. And so you have to constantly have this balance of how much investments can you front load and have downstream savings, right? Versus low capital on the front end in longer tails of expense, and again, gets the balance. Again, this is where the partnerships come into play, I think, in the risk. And you've got to have, I think, some core parties all sort of lean in on creating solutions here. You've got to have the utility, of course. You have to have the policymakers, the regulators, and then you have to have the stakeholders. And now what we're seeing more and more, you have to have the customers, especially these larger ones, come in and help with balancing that upfront versus long term. And then I think finally, and this gets all the work that we do with EnergyHub, is how can we get other customers engaged and to bring what value that they want to transact with to help with the overall system, and that in turn helps with their affordability, right? So it's a direct affordability benefit to them. And again, you're structured in such a way so it brings benefits to the entire customer base. But for them specifically, they are having this mutually beneficial value proposition that helps with their affordability while bringing on system capacity.
You mentioned your work with EnergyHub. I wonder, Seth, if you can talk a little bit more about that, and is there anything that surprised you most thus far in your work with Duke?
Yeah, so rough stats, I think, with Duke, we've got about 140,000 customers participating in the program, about 200 megawatts, I think all residential today. We've been doing smart thermostats for years. We've just added batteries. The batteries are growing really fast, and that's exciting.
I think we're the largest in the U.S., right? Program?
Largest in the U.S., correct.
Boom. Just make sure they get that talking point.
Absolutely, yeah, write that down. So, I mean, I think what's interesting is if you look at any infrastructure, you build up a diversity of tools, and so what is clear is that the grid of the future needs a diversity of tools, right? So, you've got thermal generation, that's not going away anytime soon. There are times where that's the best resource. There are times when it's not. You've got renewables. Everybody knows that there's an intermittency problem with renewables. We will build more and more storage over time. But it is clear that you need sort of all of these things so that as this new normal kicks in and you have greater extremes, the greater extremes sort of find the weaknesses in your existing systems. So you'll find that on that cold morning, a coal pile is frozen, or some piece of gas equipment that wasn't winterized sufficiently isn't working. And in that moment, looks like your storage was available or your heat pump control was available. And so just having that diversity, that's a very clear takeaway, that whatever the underlying assumptions that have kept the grid working for the last 100 years, many of those assumptions have to be questioned and then looked at and said, okay, well, where are there gaps and how do we bring in flexibility? If you think about just sort of, think about the VPP liftoff, we've got a multi-hundred gigawatt target across the U.S. But if you boil that down to like what should a utility that's serving 1 million customers, so like 1/3 of the Carolinas for Duke, what should that utility be looking after? The numbers actually start to get pretty reasonable. You say, okay, we need a couple 100,000 smart thermostats. You need maybe 80,000 EVs, maybe 30,000 batteries. You need some customers responding to dynamic rates. You need some C&I. And you look at the growth trajectories of any of these things, and we're on that trajectory. And so in the next 5-ish years, I think we will be hitting these targets right at the time when we need it. And so, hopefully we're right on that. And it will just happen to be that this massive adoption of sort of internet native, dynamically controllable DERs are coming online because people are buying them for whatever reason, just as the grid needs them. And so to close on this particular point, it gets back to this partnership question, which is how do you partner not just sort of within the ecosystem, but how do you partner between the utility and your customers? And how do you involve every customer as being part of the solution to make sure the lights are on, that the grid is clean and reliable, et cetera?
I would just add, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And so when you have DERs that are becoming more meaningful and a key pillar to keeping the lights on, that there has to be some some sophistication scaling up, and Seth, I think you've seen that in our partnerships of getting with the control center, right, and taking it to the next level on software and analytics. And so I want to make sure that is clear. It's that when you're going to be the core pillar, you're going to have operational demands, and you're going to have operational excellence to execute on these events, especially at compensation levels that we're seeing or that are asked by companies out there. So I just think that it is just so important to stress that you can't have it where a company has these devices in the homes, they decide to leave the U.S. or they go bankrupt, and then all of a sudden you have these bricks that are in a customer's home that no other company can access, and you just lost that capacity, right? Those are the things that can happen, which is why I've been pushing for industry, interoperability and different standards like that. It's just so key because you can't afford to lose, or you can't afford to not show up on that peak day.
Yeah, and to touch on that point, I mean, there's clearly a major cultural change that happens here of, utilities have built silos. Any big company builds silos around just the way they're organized. But it's pretty common in utilities to find that the folks doing customer programs are not necessarily super close working partners of the folks who are in operations, right, who are doing planning, engineering, operations. But as utilities do VPP at scale, you start to see that just naturally those silos start to break down, and they have to, right? If you're a utility and you've got a megawatt of VPPs and you're knocking on the door of the control room's probably not interested because all you've got is a megawatt. But if you show up with 25 megawatts and then 100 megawatts and then 250 megawatts, suddenly, oh hey, that thing that you mentioned to me a couple of years ago, I could really use that today. You start using it, you start getting the hands-on experience, you start saying, okay, I can actually make planning decisions based on the availability of this resource in the future. And I think that will happen naturally, but anything we can do as an industry to accelerate that sort of fluidity of working together is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great points on the needed operational excellence as well as the interoperability. And Seth, I'm glad that you mentioned the liftoff report. So DOE published a virtual power plant liftoff report that shares insights from utilities and other companies as well as the government on what it will take to continue to advance this market. Many of the folks here in the audience today are focused on big infrastructure, big hardware, and virtual power plants are really inherently aggregations of small distributed resources that are software enabled. So I know you've touched on this already in some of the discussion we've had, but anything else that you'd like to share about how VPPs fit into the utility model and how we can maximize their use for the clean energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, I could start, we hit on this, it's all of the above, right? And we're at a time where we have to innovate. And utilities aren't typically associated with innovation, right? But there's actually has been a lot of innovation in the sector. It's just there's been flat load growth, and so the innovation has been focused on other elements of the system. And so now we're in this more of a capacity need, and so that's where these partnerships are going to be so critical. With some of the hyperscalers that I mentioned. Hey, what can we do to bring on some new technologies to test them out and help them meet their clean energy goals? The government, huge role to play, right? We Duke, in partnership with the North Carolina State Energy Office and DEQ, we won a GRIP, so $57 million to do new types of transmission innovation and grid enhancing tech. So really low sag, high temperature conductors, and so all those things are needed. And this era where we pilot something small and then we wait a few years and then we file something else to make it a program. Mm-hmm. It's just we have to move faster. And this is particularly relevant in the VPP space because there's an extra element of complexity, which is you have to deal with customers. Though customer acquisition is not easy. Getting them to sign on, to opt in is not easy. So you have to innovate quickly on what works, what doesn't work. We've had some programs where I'm like, oh, people are going to just absolutely love it. We send out 80,000 emails. I get like 5 people to sign up. Others, right? And so like these are the things that we have to innovate on and move quickly. And I got to give credit to the North Carolina Commission. They recently approved what we call rapid prototyping policy, where we can quickly innovate. We have a certain amount of dollars that we can spend. We work with stakeholders, and we get things. We test it out. If it fails, we pull it out. And there's a shot clock on the pilot, so it can't be forever. Explicit metrics, and then plans to scale if it all works. And not all of them work. Like just the technologies don't work, but that's why you have to do that testing. But we can't just take this as like, oh, it's going to be 5 years maybe till we do a program. We got to move much quicker.
A few kind of quick points I'd make. I mean, one thing, EnergyHub's about a 17-year-old company, and in our history, we've gone direct to consumer with a product that doesn't exist anymore. We've been an aggregator participating in energy markets, and we've been a utility software provider. And Lon jokes that utilities are not generally seen as innovative, but in reality, almost all of the innovation in VPPs is happening at utilities. And I'm not saying that just because I'm up here with Lon. Like we tried and tried and tried to make certain things work as a sort of independent third party acting in markets. And if you compare the scale at which any company has done that versus the scale of utilities, it just does not compare. I think we have single programs that are probably as big as all of the DER participation in direct wholesale markets put together, which is really kind of surprising. The other thing, to close, you mentioned this is about aggregations of lots of small individual customers. That aggregation gives you strength. And these resources over the last 10 plus years are at 3 or 4 nines of reliability, which for the most part outperforms any other resource that I'm aware of. And so the ability to do that and sort of spread that risk and reliability over a very large group gives you strength in numbers.
Yeah, that's a great way to end, strength in numbers. I want to thank you both for your leadership in this space and for being with us here today. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks so much.